high-level conference that NASA held, that our very first money came for this ESP teaching machine, which actually worked. We had a program from NASA to see, can you teach people how to do psychic stuff with feedback and reinforcement? And the good news is that my ESP game is available on the iTunes store.
Yes.
It's called ESP Trainer, and it's a free application with feedback and reinforcement, just like we used in the NASA program, and that's available now.
I'm so glad you mentioned it, because if you didn't, I was going to make sure we did. I got to see it when you first brought that out, and as that free app, and it's fantastic. So now I'd like to just take a look at that transition between working with lasers, moving into remote viewing. Was there anything that you got from working with lasers that was useful in the remote viewing program?
It's a kind of associate. My vision is very poor, as you know, so it would be natural for me to go into optics as I was a technically oriented child and young person, so I knew I was going to go into physics and lasers. I was doing microwave physics at a time where lasers were just being talked about, so I was invited to join a laser lab in 1958. That's 3 years before there were any lasers. So I was, and they wanted me because I was skilled in optics. I knew a lot of stuff about how to set up an optics lab. So I did that with them for 3 years, and then I came to California because I was living on the Upper West Side, which is very nice in New York, but it's a hard place to raise children. So I then came to California and joined Sylvania, a big electric aerospace company, and helped them get into the laser business. Because at that point, lasers now existed, and I was one of the very few people who actually knew how to build a laser and knew how to set up a lab.
That's great.
I would say that the lasers didn't lead to ESP. I was interested in psychic stuff all my life, and after 15 years doing lasers, I was ready to leave. So in April of '72, I had gone to the CIA, for whom I had done other work. That you can't just walk into the CIA and say, I've got a cool idea, I want to teach people to be psychic. You would not get very far. But they knew me from having done laser stuff for the CIA, which I actually cannot tell you about, but I can tell you about all my ESP stuff. So they knew who I was, and they were willing to give me a chance. So because of the NASA contact and the CIA contact, I could then go to SRI together with my new friend Hal Puthoff, who I had met. He was giving a lecture on psychic abilities in the Iron Curtain. So Hal and I, together with Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, we went to the president of SRI and said, we want to create a lab, and Russell has some dough. And Charlie Anderson, who was the president, said, well, if you can support yourself, you can do that, but you got to keep a low profile, which, of course, we did not do. I mean, as soon as we had we had this top secret program where anybody who came to work for example, Charlie Targ, a distinguished psychologist from UC Davis, we wanted him as a consultant because he had done a lot of. Hal and I had no experience teaching anybody to do anything. So we thought having a psychologist on board would be a good idea, and I knew Charlie for many years. So the first thing they did is give him a top secret clearance, and they did that by going to all his university friends and saying, Charlie is up for a high security clearance because he's been working for this ESP program at Stanford. Do you think he's okay? So we had the secret program, but everybody knew that it was a secret program.
And I think the other big thing that blew it wide open, of course, is when President Jimmy Carter basically referred to the success from the secret program that had been secret at the time that the lost Soviet T-22 bomber plane went down in Africa in 1979. And I'd love it if you could talk about that, because that was it was good to get the publicity, I suppose, but it really, I think, lends credibility to the value of the program and the efficacy of it.
Well, we open the film with Jimmy Carter on screen telling a story of the fact that the CIA was looking for a downed Russian bomber with a reconnaissance bomber full of code books. It was of great interest to the code breakers of the CIA. And we were asked to try and find this plane because
well, it had gone down in the jungle.
Yeah, well, I have a whole bunch of instructions on the screen. Shall I just continue talking to you and neglect what's... Anyway, why don't I start that over? Your telephone service says I should change to some other thing, but I'm not going to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you just fine. So the jungle had basically swallowed up.
What happened is there was this in about 1978, a Russian bomber crashed in northern Africa, and the CIA couldn't find it because it was in the jungle. And even though they have satellite photography, the satellite can't see through the jungle. So as Jimmy Carter says, in the film, he says we couldn't find it because it was in the jungle. So the CIA asked Stanford to try and use one of their psychics. And in fact, we had a man in California and a woman at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the woman was actually able to draw a circle where she thought the plane was, and the guy we were working with said, I see this plane in the river between a village and the mountains, and it's in the north, adjacent to the jungle, and particularly using the coordinates they could get from the circle that the woman analyst drew. CIA was able to launch a helicopter in northern Africa and land at the coordinates that the psychic drew. And as they landed the plane, they came across villagers who were dragging sheet metal out of the river right where they put the plane down. They landed right in front of the airplane that was lost. So that was a totally successful thing, and Jimmy Carter on camera said that was the most amazing thing he saw in his entire presidency, and he then went on to reveal the top secret code name of our program, which caused no end of difficulties for us. But the fact that we have Jimmy Carter testifying to the fact that we did something useful and he was there, we all trust Jimmy Carter, so it probably actually happened.
It's quite a legacy. I'm really amazed by that, and I loved seeing that in your documentary, Third Eye Spies. I'd like to mention something that is attributed to Albert Einstein. He once called the intuitive or metaphoric mind a sacred gift, and then he added that the rational mind is a faithful servant. Keeping that idea in mind, how do you feel that we can work with an optimal balance between intuitive and rational ways of thinking?
Well, I think that the intuitive mind is available, and one of the things that we say again and again in the film is that you have these abilities. As people we hope in this film to give people permission to use an ability that we already have. My job was to sit in the dark and help people make use of their psychic abilities. Now, the psychic abilities are available, but in some countries like Iceland and Holland and Brazil and even in Russia, psychic abilities are quite permitted. For example, in Iceland, contact with psychic abilities is ordinary. If a little Icelandic kid says, I think Grandma's coming to see us, the mother will set the table and get ready for Grandma. In Nebraska, if a kid says, Grandma's coming to see us, the mother will say, don't talk nonsense. So in America, you really have no support for being psychic. It's really a forbidden ability, and you learn quickly not to talk about your psychic experiences. But in other countries, you are. And I really am not teaching people how to be psychic. I'm setting the stage in a dark room, giving them permission to quiet their mind, and all I want them to do is quiet. Typically in an experiment, I would say, if I'm working with a government visitor, I typically will say, well, your adjutant has gone to hide someplace in the Bay Area with my partner, Hal Putoff. I have no idea where they are, where they could be. I don't know anything about it. All I want you to do is quiet your mind and tell me about the surprising elements that come to view. As you quiet your mind, what pops into your awareness that's surprising? Tell me about that, and we will discover that the little drawing you make about your surprising image often will correspond strongly to where they're hiding. And I did an experiment like that with the Undersecretary of Defense. Walter LaBerge came flying into SRI in his helicopter. I mean, so much for our secret program. We have to clear the parking lot so this defense secretary can land his helicopter, convenient walking to the building. And he then described very, very well where his adjutant was hiding in a brick courtyard a few miles from SRI, brick courtyard with a fountain in the middle. He drew that, and it was a tip-top representation of where the other people were hiding. And as always, the result of a excellent remote viewing in the laboratory is they continue our funding for another year.
Yes.
So what happens is somebody comes in the laboratory, the colonel comes or the undersecretary comes and says, well, can you show me something psychic? And I said, well, sure I can. Then sit down. He said, well, who's a psychic? And my answer is, you are, but don't worry, this is very easy to do. We've been doing this for a decade now, and I will show you how to do it. So my job was a kind of psychic teacher here. I'm sitting in the dark, helping people. I'm sort of a psychic travel agent. And I'm sitting in the dark helping people get in touch with their psychic abilities, and I'm learning to do that as well. So it's as though my psychic abilities or my spiritual intentions were developed over this decade and paid for by the CIA.
Yes. So what was the difference between, say, astral travel, out-of-body experience, and remote viewing? They're kind of similar. There's
a kind of continuum from remote viewing to out-of-body experience. See, in an out-of-body experience, you bring with you your emotionality, sensitivity, sexuality, whatever you're comfortable with. You bring all of that to the remote site. And if you're thoughtful about doing that, you might have a remarkable experience, or you might have a frightening experience. But my partner and I are just physicists. We're not educated in what to do with somebody who goes to the management and says, hey, Targ separated my consciousness from my body, and I can't get it back together. That would have been the end of the program. And, right. and I knew that. So we were very circumspect in having people just describe what they see on their internal TV screen and describe that. Now, there were occasions. I once did an experiment. We were once asked to, as a test, Can you describe Brezhnev's office in the Kremlin?